excited that you've come to join us today to learn about our missionary story. We've been learning about Amy Carmichael. When we started our story, we talked about how Amy was a little girl who had brown eyes. She really wanted blue eyes, and she prayed for blue eyes, but God didn't give her blue eyes, and at the time she couldn't understand why. But as she grew older, she realized that God had a plan. God had called her to be a missionary to India. And there among those people, she began to learn about the Hindu temples. In the Hindu temples, she learned that many of the young children were being taken there and held there as slaves against their will, and they had to serve and work in the temples. Amy decided that she wanted to help and rescue these little children. But to do that, she had to change some things about herself. She had to change the way she looked. She changed the way that she dressed so that she would look like the Indian women. Otherwise, she couldn't get into the temple. And she also changed her skin color. She would use coffee to paint her skin to make it brown so she looked just like the other Indian women. And then with her brown eyes, she blended in perfectly. Isn't it amazing how God always has a plan? Well, she continued to work and serve God in those ways, and we talked about some of the little children she rescued. We talked about a young girl named Jules who ran away from her family who was forcing her to serve the Hindu gods. We talked about a little girl who her mother had given to a nurse to care for it when it was sick, and how that nurse sold that little girl to the temples. And we also talked about a little girl named Pearl Eyes who was rescued from the temple after she was mistreated, and they burned her hands while she was there. And those are just a few of the many stories we've talked about with Miss Amy and some of the children she's been rescuing. And this week we'll talk about some more of those kind of stories.
Sergeant Flynn is the leader of men. Sergeant Flynn always shouts attention. Attention! Here comes Mr. Geyser. He's older and he's wiser, reading Bible verses every day. Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Here comes Mr. Geyser. He's older and he's wiser, read the Bible with him today. Jesus wept! Jesus wept! Jesus wept!
Hey guys! Missionary's here!
Was?
Hurry before the story is over!
Huh? Oh, was? Oh, my hat, you stole my hat.
Ah!
Thank you. Ow.
But I had it.
What's mine?
Now, puppets, are y'all going to behave this week?
Yes,
No,
ma'am!
Okay, I wouldn't want to have to put y'all in timeout, and stealing Otto's hat is not very kind.
It's me.
Okay, well, let's hop right into our story this week. We've been learning about Amy Carmichael, and we've had some really exciting things that have been happening. So Amy continued to live there in India, and she was serving the Lord as she began to rescue children. Well, something she learned was that many of the children were being sold to the temples, and occasionally she would even help these children by paying the money to the parents to help protect these children. And she would give the parents the money, and she'd take the children and care for them. At other times, she rescued them straight from the temple. Sometimes she was even able to help mothers who were very poor, whose husbands had passed away, and she would give them money so that they wouldn't have to sell their children to the temple. So Amy helped in any way that she could. But as time continued, she got to where there were more and more and more children that she was rescuing from the temples. When we left off last week, I believe she had rescued 9 children. But there were many, many more children in India who needed to be rescued. And by 3 years later, from the time that she began, 3 years later, she had almost 100 children, 100 little girls. Isn't that exciting?
Yeah.
That's a lot of girls.
Exciting.
It is. Just think how many little children were rescued. 100 children rescued so that they were no longer being tortured like little Pearl Eyes, who they burned her hands. And God was using Amy to help these children. But with that many children came a lot of problems. Can anyone guess what some of those problems might be? What do you think, Sammy?
Food?
Sickness. Sickness was a big problem for these children because there were no hospitals near where they were being kept.
No.
No hospitals at all. Isn't that crazy?
Right.
I bet that all of you children live in a town where there's a hospital right there in town and you can get to it very quickly, huh?
Right.
Well,
Right.
these children did not. The town where Amy was a little town named Donover, and there was no hospitals there. And the closest hospital was almost 50 miles away, and the closest missionary hospital was even farther. So for her to be able to take them to a missionary hospital, she would have to go even farther, and that was the only place she could take them where she wouldn't have to pay a lot of money. And that was the other problem she had. Amy didn't have a lot of money to care for these children. And it takes money to take care of children. Why does it take money to take care of children?
Buying food?
Buying food.
Oh, and
yes.
clothes.
What else? Clothes. Very good.
Water.
Water. Well, yeah, water is something they would need too. What do you think, Otto?
Diapers?
Diapers for babies? Well, that's true. Of course, back then they did what's called cloth diapering. But I won't traumatize you children by talking about cloth diapering
I remember
today.
that.
But these were some of the things that Amy had to deal with. So one of the main problems she had was money. And she didn't have a lot of money, and she began to pray and ask God to provide the money they would need to be able to feed and care for these children well. The other thing that they were needing is teachers. Because children need to be educated, right?
Right.
Now, let's see. Do any of you children know how to read?
A
Sammy?
little.
I do.
You do? Good.
I do.
Good. And I bet you know that because you had a teacher who taught you, huh? Whether
Right.
that
Yeah.
teacher be your mother or at school or wherever, someone somewhere taught you to read. And
Okay.
it's important to know to read, and Amy understood that. One of the main reasons why it's very important to know how to read is because if you can't read, you can't read the Bible, God's perfect word. And Amy began to try to teach these children. But in between her missionary work, trying to rescue more children, and trying to teach these children, Amy was so busy, she didn't have any time left at all. And it was getting overwhelming. And every few days, they would find another child who needed help. And the more children they rescued, the more they were in need of more helpers. Amy began to pray and ask for God to provide more helpers. The government of India reached out at that time and offered to give them teachers. Now, doesn't that sound great?
Yes, that's real
Sounds-
good.
That's
but
what
yeah.
you would think, but it wasn't.
It
And
wasn't?
you might think, why is that not good?
Oh.
Well, I'm going to explain it to you. Because if they accepted the teachers that were provided by the government of India, they had to accept the school system. And that school system was set up where they would be taught certain things. Many of those things had to do with the Hindu religion.
Oh,
knew
And
it would be
Amy
bad.
didn't want to teach her children about the Hindu religion. So she began to pray and ask God to provide their needs. Now, as they prayed, They asked God, the Father, who provides all of our needs according to his riches and glory. And they prayed and asked God to provide them with teachers. And guess what happened?
They got teachers?
Well, before they got teachers, they got very bad news.
Oh.
Do y'all remember a missionary who was helping her? His
Yeah.
name was Thomas Walker. Y'all remember him? He was a lot of help, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, guess
He
what?
was very helpful.
He got sick and passed away. This was heartbreaking to Amy because he was like a big brother to her. As a result, she wrote a book about his work that he was doing. And she wanted people to realize the hard work and missionary work that Thomas Walker had done there in India. When that book reached England, many people began to read it, and they began to find out about the work that Thomas Walker had been doing. And as a result, God used that to touch the hearts of many people. A few were teachers, and those teachers reached out to Amy and asked if they could come and help by teaching. This was exciting and a huge blessing to Amy because it meant they didn't have to use the help from the Indian government, and they wouldn't have to bring in those bad books that taught about Hinduism.
All right.
And Amy was excited and being able to teach only the things that God would want her little girls in her home there to learn. Now, after that, what was the other thing that we said would be a struggle for them? It would be needing doctors and nurses, right?
Right.
Needing help.
And
Well,
medicine.
next week, we're going to talk about the need that they had for help with nurses and such like. But that is all we're going to be teaching on for this week. Bye. Well, hello, Amethyst. I'm so excited that you're going to be joining us for our missionary story time. We've been learning about Amy Carmichael. She grew up in Ireland and she had brown eyes, but she really wanted blue eyes. We talked about how as a little girl she wasn't sure why God wouldn't give her blue eyes, but God had a plan because God called her as a missionary to India when she grew up. There she was able to serve the Lord in many ways. She began to learn all about the culture of India. She learned about the Hindu temples, and she learned about the way that many children were taken and mistreated in those Hindu temples and held there against their will as slaves. She decided to try to rescue them. In order to do that, she had to begin to change some of the things about her. She changed the way she dressed so that she would look like the Indian women. Yeah? Is it glaring? Do I need to hold it up a little more?